know that language learners around the world make many mistakes when they learn new languages or when they start learning a new language. Most of these mistakes are not necessarily their own fault. Most of the time, it is the school authority that imposes these kind of mistakes to the teachers, or the teachers themselves that decide to follow certain rules. Number one, if any language learner starts learning any language through textbooks, you are most of the time bound to fail because you don't learn a language through textbooks, at least not at the beginning. Because if you start reading, just reading, or if you start learning any language through your eyes or with your eyes, the tendency to read and write and know how to read and write is higher, but you would find it difficult to speak. Speaking is a physical activity, and for all physical activities, mastery is always directed to practice or linked to practice. The more you practice, the better you become. So, number one, those who focus too much on textbooks, that's one thing or one of the mistakes a lot of language learners make when they learn new languages or when they start to learn a new language. The second thing is focusing too much on grammar. Of course, you want to know the rules of the game. Of course, it's very important. But I bet you, if you start learning the rules of the game at the beginning, it will prevent you from being fluent, or your fluency will suffer because speaking or fluency is something you have to practice. You don't read speaking, you don't read it, you don't study speaking, you practice speaking. And so if you focus too much on grammar, you know the rules, but you find it difficult to speak the language. Because don't forget, on the street, nobody will ask you, do you write any language? Do you know how to read and write? They'll ask you, do you speak the language? And so speaking is very, very important. So another thing or another mistake a lot of language learners make is the fear of making mistakes. Of course, if you are afraid to make mistakes, I know that it's not impossible, or it's very impossible not to be afraid or not to have apprehension. Of course, you can be apprehensive, but you should not allow it to hinder you from speaking. Because if you don't practice, you will find it difficult to be fluent in the language. So please do not avoid making mistakes, because mistakes is part of the game, is part of learning. Okay, so it's very important. The next thing or the next mistake, or number four, is not paying attention to the pronunciation of the language. Every language has its own distinct sounds, and those distinct sounds you need to learn them. If you don't, you would find it difficult to know how to speak, let alone to pronounce. And so pronunciation is very important. So first of all, you need to start with the sound. Instead of reading, you need to start learning how the sounds of the language are formed. You need to know those things and being able to discriminate those sounds through your ears. Very important, because if you don't, you would always struggle with the speaking and listening and hearing aspect of the language. So please do not make such mistakes. It's very, very important. So the next one is lack of consistency. Some people will just start for 2 weeks, they read all through non-stop, but then after 2 weeks they stop, or they reduce the effect, or they reduce the aspect or the frequency at which they learn. And then if you do that, your language mastery would slow down or even suffer to an extent. So that's it. 5 ways people make mistakes when they start learning a new language. Number one is focusing too much on grammar. You shouldn't do that. Start with pronunciation first. Then the fear of making mistakes is another thing. You don't just go ahead and make mistakes and learn. The next one is relying too much on textbooks. That's not the best, because if you learn how to read the language through your eyes, you find it difficult to be able to speak. So it's not the best to solely focus on reading. The next one is neglecting or avoiding pronunciation. Learn or start with the pronunciation of the language. Sound is language and language is sound. It's very important so to learn the language through sounds. And then the last one is the lack of consistency. So you need to be consistent, at least for the first 6 months, you need to be consistent. And after a time, you can slow down. But at the beginning, you have to be consistent in learning the language.